So now we're going to talk about the Salem witch trials, like I said. And this occurred in 1692. So remember, when you're talking about the Puritans, you're talking about really the 1600s and the 1700s. I think in the earlier lecture I'd said, so remember this is in the 1700s. I probably meant to say 17th century. But both work. I mean, but usually when you're talking about, um, the things we were talking about in the previous lecture, really mean more the 1600s. Um, well, the Salem witch trials that all occurred in 1692 in Salem Village, which today is a little is a place called Danvers. It's pretty much, I think, 20 miles from where Salem is today. And in the Salem witch trials, 19 people were hanged for being witches. One man, all right, was pressed to death with heavy stones. Right, and this was under harsh, this was part of English law. See if I can make my handwriting a little bit better this time. Um, under English law, this one man refused to plead guilty or not guilty, and so he was crushed to death. Now, this is very harsh. Okay, I realize that, and it's understandable why people would look at this and read about this and think that the Puritans were intolerant. But again, remember that this is not today. All right, this is not today. So if you, and we'll talk about this later. If you look at the way things were, how things were going in Europe at that time, it was not much different. In fact, probably even worse. Now, the mass hysteria which led to these events had begun by two young girls. And they were basically, not, they're very young. One was 9 and the other was 11. And they shouted odd things, went into convulsions. They tossed burning logs around the house. They had visions. Well, under intense questioning, the girls finally identified 3 old women as their tormentors. Now, one of the women was a West Indian practitioner of voodoo, and confessed to witchcraft in great detail. The odd behavior then spread um, to seven or eight other young girls, ages between ages of 12 and 19. Even a few adults. So this was not in, they weren't just, acting stupid. I mean, they were really, these people were there was something that was going on. All right. Somebody doesn't just, throw burning logs and goes, they weren't just going into convulsions for attention. Well, anyway, they charged others with various forms of witchcraft, including pinching and biting their victims from afar. One man even said that another man was preventing him from emptying his bladder, thereby causing him pain, excruciating pain. So he probably had a kidney stone. But everybody kind of sort of went nuts and started accusing each other of all kinds of these things. Okay, um, as in all witch hunts, people rushed to incriminate each other in order to avoid being incriminated. So, in other words, if you're somebody that may have taken up for someone that was accused of being a witch, then you would have been accused of being a witch yourself. Now, critics of the Puritans dwell on this event, implying that it exemplifies the Puritan mind, and that's why they say that the Puritans were intolerant. But the argument that I'm making here is that, well, yeah, if you look at this isolated event, you would say that they were intolerant. If you look at their society in the 1600s, all right, in the 1700s, yes, and you compare it to what's going on today, you would say yes, they were intolerant. But for that time, what I'm arguing is that they were actually more progressive and more tolerant and more democratic than their European counterparts, and for that matter, a lot of societies around the world. But again, this is just an argument. I mean, there's different ways, to view this. All right. So, and someone could make a different argument and be pretty convincing. But like I said, I think it's important because this is you always hear about how intolerant the Puritans were and that kind of thing. So I kind of wanted to give you the other view of it. All right. Now the thing is, though, is like I said, the witch hunt was largely confined to a single, small town. Right, probably the size, smaller than DeQuincy. That in Salem Village, it had already been known for a lot. There was a lot of division in that town, and the trials were finally ended by the direct and organized intervention of the principal Puritan ministers of Massachusetts, led by, you probably maybe heard of this guy named by the name of Increase Mather. Now, he did believe in witches, and you have to understand everybody back then believed in witches. All right, just like everyone else. All right. He believed that some people did attempt to practice witchcraft, but he criticized the court for violating Puritan practice by convicting people on the basis of spectral evidence or visions. Such visions might well have been produced by Satan, seeking to harm innocent people, Mather said. Mather also faulted the court for not making enough effort to determine the credibility of witnesses. Based on such arguments, the royal governor, William Phips, prohibited any further imprisonment of trials for witchcraft, dissolved the court, and freed the prisoners. Now, there were several witch hunting episodes in other colonies, and witches, and I say this in quotes, of course, continued to be executed in Europe well into the 1700s. In fact, what they did, I don't know how true this is. It may be a myth. Sometimes historical fact and myth kind of cross, but they often say that people that were accused of witchcraft in Europe they would, in order to see if they were truly witches, they would tie their hands, all right, and they would load them down with rocks and throw them in the river. And if they somehow saved themselves, all right, the only way you could do that was to use witchcraft, all right, well, then they were guilty and then they would be executed. But if they drowned, then they were innocent. So, this was the kind of thing that was going on in Europe at the time. So, to say that somehow, the Puritans in New England, all right, were somehow, super, intolerant or whatever, I think is a bit of a stretch. Now, what the thing is, though, you have to ask, the question. I mean, what the heck was going on with these people? Well, in the 1970s, some historians and really anthropologists and others had researched this. They'd been researching this for a long time, but They argued that it was ergot poisoning, which was basically a fungus that got into the wheat, which eventually made it into the village bread. And I, I guess I had for example, basically, I had a cousin one time that did some mushroom tea, and he got in a fight with the Captain Crunch guy. He jumped out of the Captain Crunch box. All right, so if in the 1600s, if they had seen this guy that had drank this mushroom tea, then they'd have thought he was practicing some kind of witchcraft or was under a spell or something like that. Okay, so really, I mean, one of the it wasn't so much the people that were necessarily always freaking out. It was the fact that they were being people were being accused of making other people go crazy. So that's the story. That's just a short story of the Salem witch trials, but there's a lot about this, and you may find a book on it. There's a little bit in the textbook about it. You can find stuff on the internet. But again, I guess the point that I'm making in the last lecture and this lecture is that were the Puritans really intolerant, as some people might suggest? And my argument is no. They were actually in some ways progressive compared to their modern counterparts.